welcome to this budget special right here on ET Now with me, Aisha Faridi. With just days to go for the Union Budget 2025, one often wonders as to what could the budget talk about when it comes to the infrastructure sector. What's going to be the focus when it comes to the fiscal policy? We've been talking about the energy transition. What is the budget going to entail on green energy? And then thereby, what is going to be the cascading effect on the infrastructure sector? What's going to be the taxation? What are going to be the funding mechanisms? And of course, the strategic initiatives that the budget could actually entail. And who better than two gentlemen joining me right here on ET Now to talk about exactly that. Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee, founder and managing trustee, the InfraVision Foundation, and Mr. Bhavik Damodar, partner at Deloitte. Gentlemen, both of you, thank you so much for your time today. Vinayak, if I could start off the discussion with you. Give me the overall focus. What do you think the budget can do this time around to try and pump prime, in your own words, the infrastructure sector?
Aisha, if you look back at the history of the NDA government from 2014 onwards, it has fundamentally used infrastructure, public expenditure in infrastructure, largely through the EPC route, to use the phrase pump prime the economy. And therefore, you've seen very large increases in the union budget. In fact, across, barring last year, the years before that had seen a consistent 30% increase year after year. You know, from 5 lakh crores to 7.5 lakh crores, from 7.5 to 10. It's only last year that there was it was a little muted because 10 became 11.1, which was a 10% increase. So the real elephant in the room right now in terms of economic thinking is how far will the government go in using infrastructure outlays in the union budget to pump prime the economy. Now, it is by and large commonly accepted now that India needs a minimum of 3.5% of the GDP allocated in the union budget, which in turn leads a further 3.5% by private capital, states, and extra budgetary resources to get 3.5 plus 3.57% of GDP as part of the infra capex spend. So if the government this time is set on following the traditional route of 3.5% in the union budget, then arithmetically, it needs to allocate 13 lakh crores. But the last point I will make here, before I hand over the baton to you, is that there is a perceptible slowdown which has been fairly widely felt by analysts, economic watchers, policy wonks, etc. There has been a slowdown in the capex along with the slight slowdown in the GDP. So if the government wants to go the extra mile and do not 7% of GDP, but 8% of GDP as gross capital formation in infrastructure, which means 4% of GDP in the union budget, then it needs to set aside or provide for an outlay of 15 lakh crores. So I am expecting anything from 13 to 15, depending on how aggressive the government and the economic thinkers in the bureaucracy and the finance minister how aggressive they want to go on using infrastructure spends to pump prime the economy. And if it does go to 15 lakh crores, it might come concomitant with a relaxation of 0.5% in the fiscal deficit. We may not then get the desired 4.5% target in fiscal deficit. It may go up to 5. But that's a lot of maths for you and your viewers to digest. So let me stop.
Let me go to the number man then. Bhavik, I want to get you in here because, I think it's pretty evident that, everyone's going to sort of look up to the budget to try and, up the economy or pump prime the economy, as Vinayak was just talking about. What's the elbow room for fiscal deficit relaxation, and how much of it do you think can actually flow into the infrastructure investment?
I completely agree with Vinayak that the infrastructure spend is a superb tool to pump prime the economy. In terms of fiscal deficit, my view is I think the government has set a target of about 4.5%. I think it will look to stay in that target because if the economy were to slow down, it'll also have to assess the impact on tax collections and its revenue sources. But having said that, I think one of the things that we'd love to see in the budget is how can the government actually have more PPP kind of projects? So, for example, reviving BOT projects in the road sector, a little bit of PPP in the railway sector, where spends are anyway large and the government, can't spend everything on its own. And similarly, some kind of policy direction incentivizing structures for sectors which historically haven't seen so much of PPP. So I think those tools, combined with a good budget allocation can actually really lead to some good capital formation.
Sure. But Vinay, do you think that perhaps this time around we could see some sort of, allocation shift, if you will? Maybe infrastructure may not be the focus. It could go to more grassroots sectors, like emphasis on health, education, or even agriculture.
So, Aisha, this is a point that I'm reasonably passionate about, and I want to first also reiterate what Bhavik said earlier. I think it is it's an imperative that government has to focus on getting PPP back, and therefore have at least some degree of lesser reliance on public expenditure and get private capital again to come in a big way. Quarter century now, there has been intense focus on two infrastructure sectors, which are popularly referred to as core infrastructure: transport, energy, and drinking water. I think there is an increasing realization that the nation now needs to invest in the umbrella term social infrastructure, which is health infrastructure in agriculture, irrigation, warehousing, cold chaining, mandis, etc., etc. I have a suspicion budget is going to veer towards a higher degree of allocation, a relatively higher emphasis on social infra than the traditional emphasis on core infra. But back to you.
Right. When I'm just taking that point forward, because, we were chatting before the show and you were talking about as to how, the energy think tanks right now suggest that, one needs to move to cleaner fuel. We have to go from coal to green energy. Now, that also has a very cascading impact on the infrastructure sector. Of course, not of the traditional kind as we know it, but of a newer kind. With this suggestion, you think, of a green transition fund to facilitate the shift from coal to green energy, what role do you see the government actually playing in terms of coordinating with, international bodies like World Bank, MDBs to try and ensure effective implementation?
See, the issue of green energy transition is a very, very difficult subject to grapple with, because as you taper off on coal and fossil fuels, there's going to be a huge degree of job losses, economic losses in terms of revenue foregone, taxes foregone, etc., etc., etc. And you need to equip not just the energy production and distribution sector, but you need to empower the entire manufacturing industry chain to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels and move to greener sources. Now, the best estimate that I have seen till date is a very detailed report by international energy think tank called iForest. And they estimated for India that India, in its transition from fossil fuel to green, would require over 84 lakh crores across the next 30 years. Now, very roughly, it's about 3 lakh crores per annum. It's a fairly large amount of transitional financing, and it is required to be done at concessional rates. Otherwise, who's going to fund this? And therefore, the point that you just made, Aisha, that there have been innuendos and outreach from the World Bank that I'm aware of, that if Indian government were to actually move forward on structuring an India Green Energy Transition Fund, then the World Bank could play a hugely supportive role in terms of a high degree of funding from the World Bank and mobilizing funds from the rest of the capital markets, including multilateral development banks and sovereign funds, etc., etc. I think that's a very important issue for the finance ministry and the economic planners and thinkers of the country to grapple with. So maybe in the budget, we will have some thoughts shared or some budgetary allocations made to begin with on creating for the Indian economy a long-term green energy transition fund. Let me stop here.
And that's precisely the point, Bhavik. I want to get you in here. We talk about infrastructure resilience always. We all know the kind of impact that climate change is having on our daily lives. How do you think the government can try and sort of ensure infrastructure resilience and also sustainability, and with that peg try and sort of tie in some tax incentives for both domestic as well as international players to sort of tie in with their business models and into infrastructure and invest more?
Yeah, so I think let me answer that in a couple of parts. I think in terms of infrastructure resilience, look, I mean, infrastructure assets are anyway built for a life of 20, 25 years. But some of the recent concerns around asset quality have kind of been highlighted. And I think the government, needs to ensure that we have certain minimum standards for assets because, you can maintain these assets, but you can't replace them, over a 20, 25-year period, especially where they've been bid out to private players, etc. And hence you need a base level of quality. The other part, and I have actually always said this, over different interviews, is that we really need to think about how can we make our infrastructure more green. So, for example, today, if you are building a new highway, how can you acquire land to actually have a small green corridor around it so that that infrastructure in itself becomes sustainable? Similarly, what can we do on existing assets? So that's the other challenge that the government will face and should kind of address here, because any new infrastructure should be fairly green infrastructure as we kind of build it out. So my view, I think that's some of the thinking points that the government should have for itself.
I want to talk about, GST on cement as well, because that plays a very key role within the infrastructure segment, right? Because the current GST on cement has multiple slabs, with the highest, I think, at 28%. What changes do you think would you advocate in the union budget to try and make infrastructure materials like cement more affordable and try and stimulate construction activity? Because that could really sort of work as a great tool.
This 28% GST on cement is completely irrational. And I've become quite unpopular amongst the finance ministry bureaucrats for year after year saying this. This is probably the fourth year when I've been advocating a reduction of the 28% GST on cement. 28% is the highest slab in GST. Please remember, GST comes in four slabs: 5%, 12%, 18, and 28. And 28 is normally reserved for luxury items and sin tax. So luxury as in high-end cars and sin as in pan masala and cigarette. You think cement should be taxed at that level at 28% when it is largely an Aam Aadmi commodity? More than 60% of cement sales are retail sales, which people from villages and small towns use to build their houses. Even in institutional sales, which are used for public works and infrastructure like roads and power plants, a reduction in GST will reduce the price of cement, and that will increase your infrastructure budgets by 10%, 7 to 10%. So there is a degree of high irrationality in keeping 28% GST on cement. And I think the union budget is not the area where GST is attacked. It is GST's issues are dealt with at the GST Council. But the union budget speech becomes a very important occasion for the government to announce or at least make known its thinking on what it proposes to do with 28% on cement. A reduction on cement very clearly will be a very major boost for the infrastructure sector and therefore for the economy. And also remember, for Aam Aadmi. Let me stop here.
Yeah, absolutely. One is the taxation benefit, and the other, Vinayak, is also how attractive do you make infrastructure for the Aam Aadmi to invest in? For instance, municipal bonds for infrastructure. How do you think the government can enhance the attractiveness and effectiveness of, say, municipal bonds as a tool for infrastructure funding? And what regulatory changes might be necessary, according to you, to support this?
Look, there have been two very strong reports on the tottering nature of urban financing or municipal financing. There's the RBI report and there's the World Bank report. The restructuring of municipal finances is far from in the US, from New York to Los Angeles, cities are funded and run on municipal bonds. But in India, it doesn't seem to gather traction. So the last budget, the finance minister announced a 10,000 crore urban infrastructure fund. We really don't know how that is going to be spent. So forget outlays in the union budget. If there is a specific incentives provided in the union budget to urban local bodies, like, let us say, an interest subvention by the central government, or if if a ULB raises 1,000 crores of municipal bonds, then the central government will subscribe through its institutions, maybe 10% of that. So there is a variety of ways in which the central government, through a budget platform pronouncement, can incentivize ULBs to think, act, and raise municipal bonds as a means of revitalizing our crumbling civic infrastructure. Let me stop here.
Bhavik, what according to you could be some of those innovative ways where the government can use the budget as a platform to try and promote infrastructure investment and across the board? You know, like Vinayak was just saying, it's something that's worked in another country and another economy. Can it really work here? Case in point being municipal bonds, for instance.
I think, from our perspective, the urban local infrastructure becomes a fairly large spend that India needs to make, because not all the development will happen centrally. A lot of it has to happen in states and in cities. And what is the way of kind of making sure that we have better private participation? So how can we make those contracts a lot more bankable? It always remains a question. So, for example, we've done smart meters now, where now we have a scheme where, the government has a kind of bucket filling mechanisms where private players are bidding for smart meter contracts. They're engaging with discoms whose finances are not always, the most up to the mark. And they're still deriving comfort that there's a mechanism where they will get paid, right? So can we do the same thing for other city projects like water, like waste, where I think there's a crying need for investment. We are severely at lower capacities than what we should be. And similarly at state level, right? Can we actually monetize some of the state assets, garner those funds to, put back into, development of assets, road networks, other infrastructure assets, etc. I think we need a little bit more policy direction there from the center on that. The other part, I think, with relating to all the financing, especially where you're looking at foreign investors, is the predictability of our tax laws, right? So whether it is the pension fund exemption, whether it is other exemptions for infrastructure, I think we need a predictable regime, because infrastructure assets are 10, 15, 20, 25-year assets. And you can't have a tax law that changes every couple of years, 3 years, 4 years, and it actually exists from budget to budget. So I think that's the other thing that we'd like the government to give some thought on.
Right. Vinayak, let me wrap it up. What's your innovative, out-of-the-box, big idea that you think that the government can work with and you would like to suggest?
Very clearly, the idea of mega coastal economic zones, probably 2 on the East Coast and about 3 on the West Coast, to actually create a hassle-free, ease of doing business type of regime, which could compete with the best offshore towns that exist, whether it is Singapore or Dubai or whatever, and provide a facilitative environment and be focused on providing or housing labor-intensive, export-oriented industries in these mega coastal economic zones. It is not an original idea. This was mooted by Dr. Panagaria as his first white paper when he took over as the first CEO of, or the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog. So can the government think, since employment and job creation is such a big issue, and we need new projects to also, be vehicles that absorb public expenditure, can we think of 4 or 5 major coastal economic zones in partnership with states for labor-intensive, export-oriented industries?
Right. Other than that, Bhavik, just to wind it up, what sort of tax incentives do you think that the budget could entail? I mean, Vinayak was just talking about forming coastal economic zones. You think models and innovative ideas such as those can work? And can the government then give a tax incentive for, building such projects?
No, I think they could absolutely work, because you've got to understand that any of these ideas will kind of result in a lot of job creation, a lot of demand for service of the hour, apart from the creation of physical infrastructure. And yeah, I mean, we have historically seen tax incentives where the government wants to promote a particular business. We've also seen subsidized land and plug and play kind of locations being set up. So I think they can work in other parts of the world. They definitely can work here. We've got a lot of the right ingredients to make this work. The only additional thing that I think we could think about also is that given that we generate about 18-20% of the data of the world, but don't really have the data center capacity, the processing capacity. The only additional thing that I'd like to add on to Vinayak is that can we actually be, one of the other data center capitals and AI capitals of the world? Because really that's going to be the future. And we also have this wide pool of engineering talent that needs jobs and, needs employment. And we have, the right caliber of people to get us there. So yeah, that's the only additional thing I'd say.
Right. Thank you, both of you, Bhavik as well as Vinayak, today for taking our time and speaking with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.